While our mums got talking in the village store. I was 3, you were 4. You look lovely, that's for sure. Just something about you. Together we went everywhere. You scratched my face, I pulled your hair. You sent me tumbling down the stairs. Just something about you. You must have known that I want you. You must have known that I want you.
Thank you very much for that. It's a wonderful pleasure always to return to this to the Salone del Libro in Torino. It's a wonderful city. I always love coming here. And not the least of the reasons why is that both my translators live here in Torino, Anna Navotti and Norman Gobetti. They've translated my entire Ibis trilogy and this book, and they've also translated what I'm going to. Well, this is really excerpts from the book, but there are headsets available, so if you want, you can always listen to the translation as well. And thank you very much, Giuseppe Russo, Daniela Pagani, who have from Neri Pozza, my amazing publishers, who've done so much to make me feel welcome here. Thank you. Who can forget those moments when something that appears to be inanimate turns out to be vitally, even dangerously alive? As, for example, when an arabesque in the pattern of a carpet is revealed to be a dog's tail, which, if stepped upon, could lead to a nipped ankle. Or when we reach for an innocent-looking vine and find it to be a worm or a snake. When a harmlessly drifting log turns out to be a crocodile. It was a shock of this kind, I imagine, that the makers of The Empire Strikes Back had in mind when they conceived of the scene in which Han Solo lands the Millennium Falcon on what he takes to be an asteroid, only to discover that he has entered the gullet of a sleeping space monster. But to recall that memorable scene now, 35 years after the making of the film, is to recognize the conditions of its impossibility. For if ever there were a Han Solo in the near or distant future, his assumptions about interplanetary objects are certain to be very different from those that prevailed in California in 1980. The humans of the future will surely understand, knowing what they presumably will know about the history of their forebears on Earth, that only in one very brief era, lasting less than 3 centuries, did a significant number of their kind hold the belief that planets are inert. When I was a child, my father took me once to the site of our ancestral village in what is now Bangladesh. On arriving there, I found myself staring not at a human settlement, but at one of the mightiest waterways in this land of miles-wide rivers. My father wanted me, I think, to recognize the non-human arbiter of our family's destiny. The story, as my father told it, was this. One day in the mid-1850s, this river had suddenly changed course, drowning the village. Only a few of the inhabitants had managed to escape to higher ground. It was this elemental act of erasure that had untethered my ancestors from their homeland, launching them on the series of journeys that preceded and made possible my own travels. Now, when I look into my family's past, the river is among those who meet my eyes, staring back as if to ask, do you recognize me? Recognition, Aristotle tells us, marks a passage from ignorance to knowledge. To recognize, then, is not the same as an initial introduction, nor does recognition require an exchange of words. More often than not, we recognize mutely. And to recognize is by no means to understand that which meets the eye. Comprehension need play no part in a moment of recognition. The most important element of the word recognition thus lies in its first syllable, which harks back to something prior, an already existing awareness that makes possible the passage from ignorance to knowledge. The moment of recognition is when that prior awareness flashes before us, effecting an instant change in our understanding of that which is beheld. Yet this flash cannot appear spontaneously. It cannot displace itself except in the presence of its lost other. Here then is the paradox of recognition. It is not a discovery but a renewed reckoning with something within oneself. This, I imagine, is what my forebears experienced on that day when the river rose up to claim their village. They awoke to the recognition of a presence that had molded their lives to the point where they had come to take it as much for granted as the air they breathed. It was in this way that I too became aware of the urgent proximity of non-human presences, through multiple instances of recognition that were forced upon me by my surroundings. I happened then to be writing about the Sundarbans, the great mangrove forest of the Bengal Delta, where the flow of water and silt is such that geological processes that usually unfold in deep time appear to occur at a speed where they can be followed from week to week and month to month. Overnight, a stretch of riverbank will disappear, sometimes taking houses and people with it. But elsewhere, a shallow mud bank will arise, and within weeks the shore will have broadened by several feet. These are, of course, cyclical processes, but even back then, in the first years of the 21st century, portents of change of a different kind could also be seen in receding shorelines and a steady encroachment of salt water on lands that had previously been cultivated. This is a landscape so dynamic that its very changeability leads to innumerable moments of recognition. Yet I would not be able to speak of these encounters as instances of recognition if some prior awareness of what I was witnessing had not already been implanted in me, perhaps by childhood experiences, like that of going to look for my ancestral village. But when it came to translating these perceptions into the medium of my imaginative life, into fiction that is, I found myself confronting challenges of a wholly different order from those that I had dealt with in my earlier work. Back then, those challenges seemed to be particular to the book I was then writing, The Hungry Tide. But now, many years later, at a moment when the accelerating impacts of global warming have begun to threaten the very existence of low-lying areas like the Sundarbans, it seems to me that those problems have far wider implications. I have come to recognize that the challenges that climate change poses for the contemporary writer, although specific in some respects, are also products of something broader and older, that they derive ultimately from the grid of literary forms and conventions that came to shape the narrative imagination in precisely that period when the accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere was rewriting the destiny of the earth. The Sundarbans are nothing like the forests that usually figure in literature. The greenery is dense, tangled, and low. The canopy is not above but around you, constantly clawing at your skin and your clothes. No breeze can enter this thicket. When the air stirs at all, it is because of the buzzing of flies and insects. In the Sundarbans, tigers are everywhere and nowhere. Often when you go ashore, you will find fresh tiger prints in the mud, but of the animal itself you will see nothing. Glimpses of tigers are exceedingly uncommon and rarely more than fleeting. Yet you cannot doubt, since the prints are so fresh, that a tiger is somewhere nearby, and you know that it is probably watching you. In this jungle, concealment is so easy for an animal that it could be just a few feet away. If it charged, you would not see it till the last minute, and even if you did, you would not be able to get away. The mud would immobilize you. Scattered through the forest are red rags fluttering on branches. These mark the sites where people have been killed by tigers. In some villages, every household has lost a member to a tiger. Everyone has a story. In the telling of these stories, a great deal hinges on the eyes. Seeing is one of their central themes. Not seeing is another. The tiger is watching you. You are aware of its gaze as you always are, but you do not see it. You do not lock eyes with it until it launches its charge. And at that moment, a shock courses through you, and you are immobilized, frozen. The folk epic of the Sundarbans, Bon Bibi Johuranama, the miracles of Bon Bibi, comes to a climax in one such moment of mutual beholding, when the tiger demon, Dokhin Rai, locks eyes with the protagonist, a boy called Dukhe. It was then from afar that the demon saw Dukhe. Long had he hungered for this much-awaited prize. In an instant he assumed his tiger disguise. How long has it been since human flesh came my way? Now bliss awaits me in the shape of this boy Dukhe. On the far mud bank, Dukhe caught sight of the beast. That tiger is the demon, and I am to be his feast. Raising its head, the tiger reared its immense back. Its jowls filled like sails as it sprang to attack. The boy's life took wing on seeing this fearsome sight. Many stories of encounters with tigers hinge upon a moment of mutual recognition like this one. To look into the tiger's eyes is to recognize a presence of which you have a prior awareness. And in that moment of contact, you realize that this presence possesses a similar awareness of you, even though it is not human. This exchange of gazes is the only communication that is possible between you and this presence, but communication it undoubtedly is. But what is it that you're communicating with at this moment of extreme danger, when your mind is in a state unlike any you've known before? An analogy that is sometimes offered is that of seeing a ghost, something that can only happen as a negation in a state of disbelief. Because if you believed it to be possible, then it would be without significance. What I am trying to suggest is perhaps best expressed by a word that recurs frequently in translations of Heidegger. That word is uncanny, and it is indeed with uncanny accuracy that my experience of the tornado is evoked in the following passage from Heidegger's essay, What is Metaphysics? In dread we say, something is uncanny. What is the it, and who feels it? We cannot say what brings on that strange feeling. It is just that way for someone. It is the receding of the meaning-giving context that presses in on us and oppresses us. Without the meaning-giving context, there is no hold on things. It is surely no coincidence that the word uncanny has begun to be used with ever greater frequency in relation to climate change. No other word comes so close to expressing the strangeness of what is unfolding around us. For these changes are not merely strange in the sense of being unknown or alien. Their uncanniness lies precisely in the fact that in these encounters we recognize things we had turned away from. That is to say, the presence and proximity of non-human interlocutors. Yet now, our gaze seems to be turning again. The uncanny and improbable events that are beating at our doors seem to have stirred a sense of recognition, an awareness that humans were never alone, that we have always been surrounded by beings of all sorts who share elements of that which we had thought to be most distinctively our own, the capacities of will, thought, and consciousness. This possibility is not by any means the most important of the many ways in which climate change challenges and refutes Enlightenment ideas. It is, however, certainly the most uncanny. For what it suggests is that non-human forces are perfectly capable of intervening in human thought, and to be alerted to such interventions is also suddenly to become uncannily aware that conversations amongst ourselves have always had other participants. It is like finding out that one's telephone has been tapped for years. or that the neighbors have been eavesdropping on family discussions? And if these are real possibilities, can we help but suspect that all the time that we imagined ourselves to be thinking about apparently inanimate objects, we were ourselves being thought by other entities? It is almost as if the mind-altering planet that Stephen Lem imagined in Solaris were our own familiar Earth. What could be more uncanny than this? These possibilities have many implications for the subject that primarily concerns me here, literary fiction. I will touch on some of these later, but for now I want to attend only to the aspect of the uncanny. On the face of it, the novel as a form would seem to be a natural home for the uncanny. After all, have not some of the greatest novelists written uncanny tales? The ghost stories of Charles Dickens, Henry James, and Rabindranath Tagore come immediately to mind. But the environmental uncanny is not the same as the uncanniness of the supernatural. It is different precisely because it pertains to non-human forces and beings. The ghosts of literary fiction are not human either, of course, but they are certainly represented as projections of beings who were once human. But animals like the Sundarbans tiger and freakish weather events like the Delhi tornado have no human reference at all. And in events triggered by climate change, there is an additional element of the uncanny. This is that the freakish weather events of today, despite their radically non-human nature, are nonetheless animated by cumulative human actions. In that sense, the events set in motion by global warming have a more intimate connection with humans than did the climatic phenomena of the past. This is because we have all contributed in some measure, great or small, to their making. They are the mysterious work of our own hands, returning to haunt us in unthinkable shapes and forms. All of this makes climate change events peculiarly resistant to the customary frames that literature has applied to nature. They are too powerful, too grotesque, too dangerous, and too accusatory to be written about in a lyrical or elegiac or romantic vein. Indeed, in that these events are not entirely of nature, whatever that might be, they confound the very idea of nature writing or ecological writing. The very processes that allowed us to recognize Gaia for what it is are those that killed nature, as we had grown accustomed to think of it. It follows that certain literary modes and forms that were geared to that now vanished entity are dead as well. In the final part of my novel, The Hungry Tide, there is a scene in which a cyclone sends a gigantic storm surge into the Sundarbans. The wave results in the death of one of the principal characters, who gives his life protecting another. The scene was extraordinarily difficult to write. In preparation for it, I combed through a great deal of material on catastrophic waves, storm surges, as well as tsunamis. In the process, as often happens in writing fiction, the wave and the plight of my characters became frighteningly real. The Hungry Tide was published in the summer of 2004. A few months after the publication, on the night of December 25th, I was back in my family home in Kolkata. The next morning, on logging onto the net, I learned that a cataclysmic tsunami had been set off by a massive undersea earthquake in the Indian Ocean. The news had a deeply unsettling effect on me. Live footage of the tsunami merged with the images that had been implanted in my mind by the writing of The Hungry Tide in a way that was almost overwhelming. I became frantic. I could not focus on anything. A couple of days later, I obtained a commission from a newspaper and flew to Port Blair, the capital of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, many of which had been devastated by the tsunami. After a few days, I was able to board an Indian Air Force plane that was carrying supplies to one of the worst affected of the Nicobar Islands. Unlike the Andamans, which rise steeply from the sea, the Nicobars are low-lying islands. Being situated close to the quake's epicenter, they had been very badly hit. Many settlements had been razed. After disembarking at an Air Force base, I visited a shoreside town called Malacca that had been reduced literally to its foundations. Of the houses, only the floors were left, and here and there the stump of a wall. It was as though the place had been hit by a bomb that was designed specifically to destroy all things human. For one of the strangest aspects of the scene was that the coconut palms were largely unaffected. They stood serenely amidst the rubble, their fronds waving gently in the breeze that was blowing in from the sparkling, sun-drenched sea. I wrote in my notebook, the damage was limited to a half-mile radius along the shore. In the island's interior, everything is tranquil, peaceful, and indeed astonishingly beautiful. One of the ironies of the situation is that the most upwardly mobile people on the island were living at its edges. Such was the pattern of settlement that the indigenous islanders lived mainly in the interior. They were largely unaffected by the tsunami. Those who had settled along the seashore were mainly middle-class people from the mainland. In settling where they had silently expressed their trust in the belief that highly improbable events belong not in the real world but in fantasy. In other words, even here, in a place about as far removed as possible from the metropolitan centers that have shaped middle-class lifestyles, the distribution of the population had come to reflect the uniformitarian expectations that are rooted in the regularity of bourgeois life. At the Air Force base where my plane had landed, there was another even more dramatic illustration of this. The functional parts of the base, where the planes and machinery were kept, were located to the rear, well away from the water. The living areas, comprising of pretty little two-story houses, were built much closer to the sea, at the edge of a beautiful palm-fringed beach. As always in military matters, the protocols of rank were strictly observed. The higher the rank of the officers, the closer their houses were to the water, and the better the view that they and their families enjoyed. Such was the design of the base that the likelihood of survival was very small, and inasmuch as it existed at all, was in inverse relation to rank. The commander's house was thus the first to be hit. The sight of the houses was disturbing for reasons beyond the immediate tragedy of the tsunami and the many lives that had been lost there. The design of the base suggested a complacency that was itself a kind of madness. Nor could the sighting of these buildings be attributed to the usual improvisatory muddle of Indian patterns of settlement. The base had to have been designed and built by a government agency. The site had clearly been chosen and approved by hard-headed military men and state-appointed engineers. It was as if, in being adopted by the state, the bourgeois belief in the regularity of the world had been carried to the point of derangement. A special place ought to be reserved in hell, I thought to myself, for planners who build with such reckless disregard for their surroundings. Then one day, not long afterwards, while flying into New York's John F. Kennedy Airport, I looked out of the window and spotted Far Rockaway and Long Beach, the thickly populated Long Island neighborhoods that separate the airport from the Atlantic Ocean. Looking down from above, it was clear that those long rows of apartment blocks were sitting upon what had once been barrier islands, and that in the event of a major storm surge, they would be swamped, as indeed they were when Hurricane Sandy hit the area in 2012. Yet it was clear also that these neighborhoods had not sprung up haphazardly. The sanction of the state was evident in the ordered geometry of their streets. Only then did it strike me that the location of that base in the Nicobars was by no means anomalous. The builders had not in any sense departed from accepted global norms. To the contrary, they had merely followed the example of the European colonists who had founded cities like Bombay or Mumbai, Madras, Chennai, New York, Singapore, and Hong Kong, all of which are sited directly on the ocean. Thinking about this, it occurred to me one day that pre-Enlightenment cities were not usually built on the edge of the water. The old ports of Europe, like London, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Stockholm, Lisbon, and Hamburg, are all protected from the open ocean by bays, estuaries, or deltaic river systems. The same is true of old Asian ports. Cochin, Surat, Tamluk, Marau, Guangzhou, Hangzhou, and Malacca are all cases to point. It is as if there was a general acceptance before the early modern era. The provision had to be made for the unpredictable furies of the ocean, tsunamis, storm surges, and the like. Mumbai's history provides a particularly telling example of the evolution of European attitudes in this regard. Today's Mumbai was originally a small archipelago of some half-dozen islands. Although settlements have existed on these islands for millennia, none of them was of significant size. The city that is now Mumbai began to take shape only after the arrival of the Portuguese in the 16th century. But the Portuguese, being pre-Enlightenment colonizers, chose to build their first major settlement at Bassein or Vasai on the mainland. It was only when the island of Bombay passed into British hands that a city began to rise on the archipelago itself. By the end of the 19th century, the islands had become a peninsula, jutting out from the mainland in such a fashion as to expose its entire western flank to the open ocean. Today, with cyclonic activity increasing rapidly in the Arabian Sea, this city of over 20 million inhabitants is dangerously exposed. The damage that could be inflicted on it by a superstorm like Sandy is too horrifying to contemplate. It is no accident that cities like Mumbai, New York, Boston, and Kolkata were all brought into being by the processes of early globalization. They were linked to each other not only through the circumstances of their founding, but also through certain patterns of trade in people and in commodities, such as opium, cotton, whale oil, etc., that enabled the expansion and acceleration of Western economies. These cities were thus the drivers of the very processes that now threaten them with destruction. In that sense, their predicament is but an especially heightened instance of a plight that is now universal, the plight that I call the Great Derangement.